She arrived at that farm with nothing but the clothes on her back and a battered suitcase, and what she found in that place changed not only her life, but her understanding of what it means to have someone by your side. Can you imagine arriving in a completely strange place, broken on the inside, and finding the kind of man the world rarely sees anymore? The kind who carries mountains on his shoulders without asking for anything in return, who faces danger like one goes to fetch water from the well, who protects without fanfare and loves in silence. But this story happened in rural Kentucky in March 1935, in a time when a man's character was worth more than gold. Before we continue, leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. This helps the channel grow immensely and brings more emotional stories like this to you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any stories of resilience and true love. Helen Carter was 22 years old when the life she knew collapsed like a house of cards in a gale. The only daughter of Augustus Carter, a respected merchant in Chicago, she grew up with a refined education, piano lessons on Sunday afternoons, French literature on the shelves, and dresses made of imported silk. They weren't wealthy like the oil tycoons, but they lived with enough comfort that Helen never knew what it was to go without. Her mother, Cecilia, had died of typhoid when Helen was 15, leaving father and daughter united in a grief that brought them even closer. But fate has cruel ways of reminding us that control is an illusion. In January 1935, the economic depression that had been ravaging the country reached Augustus's warehouse with the force of a tsunami. Accumulated debts, impatient creditors, expired promissory notes. Helen saw her father age 10 years in 2 weeks, his shoulders curving under an invisible weight, his eyes losing their shine. He tried to hide the gravity of the situation from her, forcing a smile when she entered the room, changing the subject when she asked about the letters that arrived daily. But Helen was no fool. She noticed the furniture disappearing piece by piece, the whispers of the employees, the way her father avoided her gaze. In the early hours of February 15th, Helen woke up to a strange noise coming from the study. She went down the stairs with a racing heart, bare feet on the cold floor. She found the door locked. She called for her father once, twice, 3 times. The silence that followed was the kind that marks a soul forever. When the neighbor finally broke down the door, Augustus Carter was already gone, an empty bottle of sleeping pills on the table beside a letter that explained everything. Complete bankruptcy, debts that would consume even the furniture in the house, a shame too great to face, a plea for forgiveness to the daughter he loved more than life itself. Helen didn't cry at the funeral. She sat beside the casket with a stone-faced expression, accepting condolences with silent nods. The tears only came 3 days later when the creditors arrived to seize the house. It was Mrs. Miller, the family's old cook, who held Helen by the shoulders and told her the cruel truth. "Child, you need to leave here and find a path. Your father is gone, God rest his soul, but you are alive, young and educated. I have a cousin in the country who knows people. She might find you a position as a housekeeper or a teacher. It's not what you deserve, but it's what we have." Helen accepted because there was no alternative. Mrs. Miller's cousin was named Josephine, and she lived in a small town called Hopewell in rural Kentucky, knowing everyone within a 50-mile radius. It was Josephine who mentioned 3 Rivers Farm. "The owner needs someone to take care of the house," Josephine said with that direct country manner. "He's a widower, a serious man, hard-working. He won't be disrespectful. You can rest easy. The pay isn't much, but there's a roof, food, and he's good people. If you know how to handle yourself, it could be a good arrangement." Helen asked nothing more. She wasn't in a position to choose. She gathered the few clothes the creditors allowed her to keep, packed them into the battered suitcase that had been her mother's, and accepted a ride Josephine secured on a delivery truck heading that way. The journey took 2 whole days, Potholed dirt roads, dust seeping in from all sides, the sun beating down without mercy. Helen travelled in the back with sacks of flour and tools, her body aching with every bump, her soul aching even more. When she finally arrived in Hopewell on a hot afternoon in March, Helen stepped off the truck with shaky legs and a heavy heart. The town was small, a dirt main street, simple houses, a modest church in the central square. Josephine welcomed her with a tight hug and strong coffee. "Tomorrow morning, I'll take you to the farm," she said, while preparing a tiny room at the back of the house. "Mr. Arthur Vance already knows you're coming. He's a man of few words, but fair. He treats everyone well. You'll see." That night, lying on the thin mattress, listening to the strange sounds of the countryside, crickets, bullfrogs, wind in the trees, Helen allowed herself to cry for the last time. She cried for the father who chose death over fighting. She cried for the mother who left too soon. She cried for the life she had and the terrifying uncertainty of what was to come. When the sun rose the next morning, she washed her face, pinned up her hair, put on the simplest dress she owned, and decided she would survive. She didn't know how, but she would survive. Three Rivers Farm was 5 miles from town, a path Josephine and Helen travelled in a borrowed wagon. The morning was clear, a cloudless blue sky, the air still fresh before the heat of the day. Helen watched the landscape change, the town giving way to open fields, corn and tobacco crops, then denser woods. Josephine chattered about the region's history, who was who married whom, who owed whom. But when the subject turned to Arthur Vance, her tone changed, gaining an almost reverent respect. "That man is different, honey," Josephine said, looking ahead. "Never seen anyone like him. Strong as a bull, works like 10 men, but humble as they come. When old man Christopher almost lost his homestead because Colonel Dawson wanted to take it, it was Arthur who faced down the hired guns, alone. 3 armed men, and him with nothing but courage. He sent them packing and even paid Christopher's debt without telling a soul. We only knew because Christopher's wife told it crying at church service. And you know what Arthur said when they asked him? That it was nothing, that anyone would have done the same. Anyone, except nobody else had the guts." Helen listened with growing attention. "And his wife?" she asked carefully. Josephine sighed deeply. "Isabel, a beautiful, sweet girl, died 4 years ago in a wagon accident. The wheel came loose on a slope, the wagon tipped. She hit her head on a rock. When they found her, it was too late. Arthur found her. They say he went 3 days without speaking to a soul, just sitting by her body. Since then he lives alone, works, helps those in need, but doesn't let anyone get close, not really. It's like a part of him died with her." The gate of 3 Rivers Farm appeared ahead, a simple wooden structure with the name carved into it. The property stretched over rolling hills, green pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, a farmhouse that wasn't a mansion but was a respectable size, a solid construction of wood and stone with a wide porch. Everything was meticulously cared for, fences in order, tools organized, crops aligned. It was evident that a man who understood hard work lived here. Josephine stopped the wagon near the house. Before they could climb down, the side door opened and Hattie appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a woman of about 60, short, round, with a kind face marked by time and sun. "You've arrived, thank God," she said with a wide smile. "Good trip? Come in, child. You must be tired." Helen climbed down from the wagon, feeling the stiffness in her legs. She took the suitcase, which Josephine insisted on carrying, and followed Hattie inside. The house was clean, organized, but had that empty quality of a place where no one truly lives, only exists. Good furniture, but without personal touches, walls without portraits, a silence that hung too heavy. Hattie showed her the room that would be Helen's. A small but comfortable room at the back, a simple bed, a wardrobe, a window overlooking the orchard. "Your little corner," the older woman said gently. "Mr. Vance said you start tomorrow. Today is for resting and settling in." "And where is Mr. Vance?" Helen asked with a voice she tried to keep steady. Hattie pointed vaguely towards the back of the property. "Down in the lower fields, fixing a fence. Should be back at lunchtime. He's punctual as a clock." Josephine stayed a little longer, helped Helen arrange her few things, and said goodbye with a promise to visit soon. When she left, Helen found herself alone in a strange room, in a strange house, waiting for a man she didn't know who would be her boss from then on. She spent the morning helping Hattie in the kitchen, more to have something to do than out of obligation. The older woman talked about the house routine, how Mr. Vance liked things, his schedule. "He's simple," Hattie said while peeling potatoes. "Eats anything, never complains, works from before sunrise until dark. Only stops when his body can't take any more. I try to make him rest, but he's stubborn. Says work keeps the bad thoughts away." Noon arrived with the punctuality Hattie had predicted. Helen was setting the plates on the table when she heard heavy but controlled footsteps on the porch. The door opened and Arthur Vance entered, taking off his leather hat, dusting off his pants with automatic movements. The first thing Helen noticed was the sheer size of the man. Tall, broad shoulders of someone who has carried weight his whole life. Muscular arms, visible even under the long-sleeved shirt. Dark hair, slightly long, a few days' stubble, skin tanned by the sun. But it was the eyes that caught her off guard. Dark brown, deep, with that expression of someone who has seen too much pain and learned to keep it all inside. He had a rugged face, not a man who would be called handsome in the classic sense, but there was something about him, a presence, a contained strength that commanded attention. Arthur stopped when he saw Helen. His eyes swept over her quickly, a rapid assessment but not disrespectful, and he nodded. "You must be Miss Carter," he said in a deep, measured voice. "Welcome to Three Rivers Farm. I hope the room is suitable." Helen replied that it was, thanked him for the opportunity, keeping her voice steady despite the nervousness tightening her stomach. Arthur listened in silence, nodded again, and went to wash his hands in the basin near the door before sitting at the table. During lunch, he ate in almost complete silence, answering Hattie's questions with monosyllables, not looking directly at Helen. It wasn't exactly coldness, but a deliberate distance, as if he kept everyone at arm's length for safety. When he finished, Arthur stood up, thanked them for the food in a low voice, and turned to Helen. "Tomorrow Hattie will explain your duties," he said bluntly. "The house needs care. There are clothes that need mending, general organization. You eat with us. You're not a servant in the sense of being treated differently. Here, everyone works. Everyone eats at the same table. If you need anything, just speak to Hattie." And he put his hat back on, went out the door, and was on his way to the fields before Helen could reply. Hattie chuckled softly, seeing Helen's face. "Don't take it to heart, dear. He's just like that. It's not rudeness, it's his way. Since Isabel died, he forgot how to talk to people. But he's a good man, you'll see. The good kind that doesn't exist anymore." The following days established a routine that Helen absorbed quickly. She woke with the sun, helped Hattie with breakfast, took care of cleaning the house, mended clothes, organized supplies. The work was hard. Hands that had never done heavy labor began to callous. Her body ached at the end of the day. But there was dignity in it, there was purpose. And there was Arthur, a constant but distant presence, a man who worked until his body screamed for mercy. Helen began to observe him without him noticing. She saw the way he treated the hands working on the farm, with respect, paying on time, asking about their families. When old Joe's son fell ill, Arthur sent for a doctor in town and paid for everything without blinking. When a neighbor's fence fell in a storm, Arthur spent the entire Sunday helping to fix it, and whenever someone thanked him, he brushed it off, changed the subject, acted as if he had done nothing special. One afternoon, 10 days after Helen's arrival, she was hanging laundry on the line when she heard raised voices coming from the property entrance. It was 3 men on horseback, hard types with guns visible in their holsters. The leader, a thin man with a pencil moustache and a cruel look, spoke loudly. "Message from Colonel Dawson," he said with a voice carrying barely disguised menace. "The borderlands, that strip near the river. The colonel is interested. He makes a fair offer, $3,000. Arthur was standing near the corral. He had stopped fixing the gate when the men arrived. His posture shifted subtly, his shoulders squared, his jaw tightened, but his voice came out calm as still water. "That land is not for sale." The man with the mustache gave a dry, humorless laugh. "The colonel doesn't like hearing no." Helen saw Arthur take a step forward, a small movement loaded with meaning. "Then the colonel will have to learn." "Now get off my property." The 3 men exchanged glances. The leader spat on the ground. "You'll regret this, Vance." Arthur didn't reply, just stood there, waiting. There was something about him in that moment, a dangerous stillness, the kind of calm that comes before a storm. The thugs must have felt it too, because after a few more seconds of staring, they turned their horses and rode off with thinly veiled threats hanging in the air. When they disappeared from view, Helen saw Arthur let out the breath he was holding, pass a hand over his face. He stood there for a long moment, looking where the men had gone, and only then went back to the gate as if nothing had happened. But Helen had seen it, seen the courage, seen the firmness, seen the exhaustion too. A man carrying everyone's protection on his shoulders without rest. That night during dinner, Helen broke the usual silence. "Those men who came today, are they dangerous?" Arthur looked up from his plate, surprised by the direct question. Hattie tensed. He studied Helen for a moment before answering. "Colonel Dawson is a man who takes what he wants from those who can't defend themselves," he said in a neutral voice. "He uses hired guns to scare simple folks, but he doesn't come in here." Helen held his gaze. "And if he tries with force?" Arthur gave a half-smile without joy. "Then he'll find resistance." It was Hattie who explained later when Arthur had gone out. "Colonel Dawson owns land in the next county, dear. Wealthy man, cruel, thinks he can buy or take whatever he wants. He's already pushed 3 small farmers off their land in the last 2 years. Sends the thugs, threatens the family, makes life impossible until the person sells for pennies. Arthur is the only one who stands up to him. He's chased thugs off here twice. The colonel doesn't forget. He's waiting for an opportunity to strike back." Helen felt something tighten in her chest. "And Mr. Vance isn't afraid?" she asked softly. Hattie shook her head. "He has fear, he's not crazy. But he has something stronger than fear, a sense of justice. He can't stand seeing people being crushed by those with power. It's stronger than him he needs to protect, even if it costs him dearly." The days passed, and Helen found herself thinking about Arthur more than she should. It wasn't just admiration for his courage, though that existed. It was the little things she was noticing, the way he fixed the broken bench in the kitchen without anyone asking, how he left wildflowers in a jar on the table after Helen mentioned in passing that she liked flowers, how he oiled the hinges of her bedroom window that squeaked at night. Small gestures without fanfare that spoke louder than 1,000 words. And there were the moments when their eyes met by accident. Helen washing dishes and Arthur coming in for water, her hanging clothes and him passing to the fields. Brief seconds where eyes met and something passed between them, a quick spark that neither dared to name. Arthur always looked away first, as if he had touched a hot coal, and went on his way. But Helen saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his breathing changed subtly. One afternoon in April, a heavy storm arrived without warning. Helen was alone in the house. Hattie had gone to visit her sister in town. The sky turned dark in minutes, the wind began to howl, rain fell with fury. Helen ran to close windows, gather clothes from the line, but the wind was too strong. One of the shutters broke loose, banging against the wall with a crash. She tried to hold it, but it was too heavy, the wind pulling hard. Suddenly, strong hands grabbed the shutter beside hers. Arthur was there, soaked from the rain, hair plastered to his forehead, shirt clinging to his body. Together they managed to secure the shutter back in place. But another one came loose on the other side of the house. Arthur ran, Helen behind him. They worked together under the storm, him holding, her tying, cold rain soaking them both to the bone. When they finally got everything secured, they ran inside. They stood in the hallway dripping water, breathing heavy, clothes soaked. Helen began to shiver. She didn't know if it was cold or adrenaline. Arthur noticed immediately. "You're freezing," he said with a worried voice. "You need to change clothes, or you'll get sick." And before she could protest, he grabbed a throw blanket from the sofa and placed it around her shoulders with care, hands large but gentle. His fingers grazed her neck by accident as he adjusted the blanket. It was a second's touch, nothing more, but they both froze. Their eyes met, and this time they didn't look away. Helen saw something break inside those dark eyes, defenses lowering for a fraction of a second, letting vulnerability show. Arthur was too close. She could see the raindrops on his eyelashes, his chest rising and falling with breath that was too controlled. Arthur began with a raspy voice, but stopped. His hand was still on her shoulder over the blanket. "Thank you for the help," he finally managed to speak. "You didn't have to." Helen shook her head. "Yes, I did. It's my home too now." Something changed in his face upon hearing that. My home too now. Simple words that meant so much. He took a step back, letting his hand fall, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned. "I'm going to change," he murmured. And he left with steps that were too quick. Helen stood there, shivering under the blanket, heart beating out of rhythm. Something had happened in those seconds. Something had shifted, and she didn't know if she was ready for what that meant. That night, she barely slept. She tossed and turned in bed, thinking about the accidental touch, the look, the way Arthur had said, "My home too," as if the words were precious jewels. It was madness to think of him that way. He was her boss, a widower still in mourning, a man who clearly had walls around his heart. And she was a girl without a dowry, without family, dependent on his charity. Any feeling beyond gratitude was inappropriate, dangerous, destined for disappointment. But the heart rarely listens to reason. When the sun rose, Helen got up determined to maintain professional distance. She would do her job, be grateful for the opportunity, but she wouldn't allow herself to feel what she was starting to feel. It was a sensible, rational plan. It lasted exactly until breakfast, when Arthur walked into the kitchen and their eyes met across the table. And Helen knew, with absolute certainty tightening her chest, that it was already too late. Whatever this was, it already had roots. And pulling up roots always hurts. The following days were a fragile balance, like walking a tightrope over a canyon neither wanted to acknowledge. Arthur returned to the pattern of polite distance, leaving before dawn, returning at dark, speaking only what was necessary. But Helen noticed subtle differences no one else would see. The way he lingered a fraction of a second longer when she poured coffee. How his eyes sought her out unwittingly when he thought no one was looking. How his voice became slightly softer when he addressed her. And Helen, try as she might to maintain her resolve of professional distance, found herself doing the same. She made his coffee just the way he liked it without needing to ask. Left fresh water on the porch when she knew he'd be coming back from the upper fields under the hot sun. Mended his shirts with extra care, small firm stitches that would last for years. Little cares that went beyond obligation, silent whispers of affection she didn't dare vocalize. Hattie watched everything with the wise eyes of someone who has lived long and understands the human heart. She said nothing, but smiled faintly when she saw Arthur fix something Helen had mentioned was broken. or when Helen set aside the larger stakes for his plate without realizing she was doing it. The older woman recognized the signs, the ancient dance of two hearts drawing closer while afraid of getting burned. May arrived bringing colder mornings and intense work preparing for winter. Arthur hired 3 more temporary hands to fix roofs, reinforce fences, stock firewood. 3 Rivers Farm gained unusual movement, male voices, laughter, heavy work happening in every corner. Helen and Hattie cooked for 7 people, work that left them exhausted at the end of the day, but also brought new life to that house that had breathed loneliness for too long. It was during this period that Helen got to know the men working in the region better. Mr. Jenkins, a 50-year-old with a big family and an easy smile. Tommy, a 20-year-old full of energy and jokes. And Pete, a serious man in his 40s who had worked for Arthur for over 10 years and had a brother's loyalty. One morning, while Helen was bringing coffee and biscuits to the men fixing the barn roof, she heard Pete telling a story. Tommy had asked why the boss was so respected in the region, what was so special about him. Pete stopped working, sat on the beam, and spoke with a reverence that wasn't feigned. "I'll tell you something, kid," Pete said, lighting a hand-rolled cigarette. 3 years ago, Dawson sent hired guns to collect a debt from old Anthony, that farmer near the church. A debt that didn't exist, forged papers, but the old man couldn't read well. The thugs arrived at dinner time, beat the old man in front of his family, said they'd be back in 3 days to take the farm. Anthony's wife went crying to the Reverend for help. The Reverend came to talk to Arthur. Pete took a long drag before continuing. Arthur said nothing, just asked to see the paper, studied it, saw it was fake, and said simply, "I'll handle it." On the day the thugs returned, Arthur was there, alone, unarmed, sitting on old Anthony's porch waiting. It was 4 armed men this time, came all arrogant saying the farm was the Colonel's now. Arthur stood up slowly and said nobody was taking anything because the debt was fake and everyone there knew it. Tommy was open-mouthed. And then? Pete smiled with pride. Then the head thug drew his gun, but before he could point it, Arthur was on him. Never seen a man move so fast. Disarmed the guy with one hand, threw the gun far away, and looked at the other 3. "Anyone else want to try?" he asked. The thugs got on their horses and left. And you know what Arthur did after? Went back to the farm like he'd just gone to buy bread. Didn't tell anyone, didn't want credit, nothing. We only knew because old Anthony spread the word. Helen listened from where she stood, pretending to arrange cups, but hanging on every word. Mr. Jenkins, who was nailing boards, added without looking up, "There's more." When the drought hit hard 2 years ago, 3 families of small farmers were starving. Arthur sent a wagon with supplies to each one, said it was a donation from the church. Only Reverend Thomas later let slip that it was Arthur who paid for everything. And when they questioned him, you know what he said, that he had surplus harvest and didn't want it to spoil. Surplus. Even though everyone knows he sold cattle he was saving to buy new land just to do it. Tommy shook his head in disbelief. But why does he do it? Pete looked at the boy like one looks at a child who still has much to learn. Because some men are born with the burden of protecting others, kid. Don't choose it. Don't ask for it. Just are that way. Arthur is that type. Since he lost his wife, I think working and helping others is what keeps him from giving up on everything. It's what gives meaning to his life. The words echoed in Helen's head all day. A man who carries the burden of protecting others, who found meaning in life through serving, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And suddenly she understood the deep loneliness she saw in his eyes. Arthur felt unworthy of his own happiness, as if he only had the right to work and bleed for others, never to receive care in return. If you're enjoying the story so far, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear a story about true love. That afternoon, Helen made a decision. She didn't know if it was wise, if it would work, if it wouldn't end in pain. But she decided she would try to reach that man, cross the walls he built, show him he deserved more than a solitary existence carrying the world on his shoulders, not in a blatant way that would scare him, but with patience, with care, with the same silent gestures he used to care for everyone else. It started small. When Arthur came back that night with a nasty cut on his hand from working with barbed wire, Helen didn't just bring water and a clean cloth as Hattie always did. She sat beside him at the table, took his large calloused hand carefully, cleaned the wound with a gentleness that contrasted with the strength of that hand. Arthur tensed, almost pulled his hand back, but Helen held firm without hurting him. "You need to take care of this properly, or it will get infected," she said with a calm voice while washing the cut. Arthur didn't answer, but didn't pull away either. He sat there motionless, looking down while she worked. Helen felt the moment his breathing changed, when his muscles relaxed a fraction. She tied the clean cloth around his hand, her fingers brushing his skin more than strictly necessary. "Ready," she said finally, but lingered in letting go of his hand. When she looked up, Arthur was looking at her with an expression that made her heart skip. It was gratitude mixed with something deeper, more dangerous, something that looked like a hunger for affection that had been denied for too long. "Thank you," he said with a hoarse voice. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," Helen replied, holding his gaze. And everything hung on that "wanted to." The layers of meaning neither dared to unpack. Arthur stood up abruptly, murmured something about early work the next day, and left. But Helen saw the way his bandaged hand went to his chest, pressed there as if trying to calm a racing heart, and she knew she had reached him, even if only a little. The following days brought subtle but noticeable change. Arthur started staying for dinner instead of eating fast and leaving, started answering questions with complete sentences instead of monosyllables, started looking at Helen when he spoke, holding her gaze for seconds longer, and he started to smile, small smiles, rare as springs in a desert but real. The first time Helen made Arthur truly laugh was an accident. She was trying to reach a jar of preserves on a high shelf, stretching on tiptoes when the chair she used for support wobbled. She let out a small yelp, losing balance, but before falling, strong arms caught her by the waist. Arthur held her firmly, set her back on the floor with care. "You're going to break your neck one of these days," he said, but there was a tone of hidden laughter in his voice. Helen turned, still inside the circle of his arms, unconscious, or perhaps very conscious of the proximity. "I was going to get it," she protested with fake dignity. "Of course you were," Arthur replied, and this time the smile appeared for real, transforming his serious face into something younger, lighter. Helen laughed too, and for a moment they stood there too close, laughing together at nonsense, and the weight that always hung over that house seemed to evaporate. It was Hattie who broke the moment, entering the kitchen with a basket of eggs. She stopped at the door, looked at them and smiled faintly before starting to put away the eggs as if she hadn't seen anything. But when Arthur left, she gave Helen a little pat on the shoulder. "You're doing him good," she whispered, "making him come back to life. But every light has a shadow waiting, and the shadow of Three Rivers Farm had a name, Colonel Dawson." It was Mr. Jenkins who brought the news on a cold June morning. He arrived earlier than usual, worried face, asked to speak to Arthur privately. Helen saw the two talking near the corral, saw Arthur's posture become rigid, his jaw tight. When Jenkins left, Arthur stood there for a long time looking at the horizon, hands in pockets, invisible weight descending on his shoulders again. During lunch, Pete asked if there was a problem. Arthur chewed slowly before answering. "Dawson is calling in old debts from 3 families, he said with a controlled voice. "Debts that were already paid, but he has papers saying otherwise. He's going to take the land if no one does anything." Pete cursed softly. "And you're going to do something?" It wasn't a question. Arthur looked at his plate. "I'll talk to the judge first, see if there's a legal way to solve it." Pete laughed without humor. The judge is Dawson's friend. You know that. Arthur nodded wearily. I know, but I need to try the right way first. Helen saw the worry growing in him over the next few days. Arthur went to town, talked to the judge, came back with a closed face that said everything. Went to visit the 3 threatened families, came back even gloomier. Dawson had chosen his victims well. They were all small families, without resources to fight, without connections to ask for help. They were desperate and ready to accept any crumb the colonel offered for the land they had cultivated their whole lives. One particularly tense night, Helen found Arthur sitting alone on the porch after everyone had gone to sleep. He was in the rocking chair he never used, looking into the darkness, a cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. She almost went back inside, almost left him alone with his thoughts, but something made her stay. "Can I sit?" she asked softly. Arthur gave a small start, hadn't noticed her there. He looked at Helen for a moment before nodding to the chair next to him. They sat in silence for minutes that stretched, only night sounds around. Crickets, wind in the trees, a cow mooing in the distance. It was Arthur who spoke first. "Do you think there's a limit," he asked suddenly, "to how many times a person can fight before getting tired?" The question was so unexpected, so vulnerable, that Helen took a moment to process. She looked at his profile in the gloom, the tense line of his jaw, the exhaustion he usually hid so well. "I think it depends on why you're fighting," she answered carefully. "If you're fighting just because you think you should, because it's expected, then yes, you get tired. But if you're fighting for something that truly matters, for people you love, then you find strength always, even when you think you have none left." Arthur turned his head to look at her directly. "And if everything you love ends up being taken from you?" he asked with a low voice loaded with ancient pain. "If every time you allow yourself to care, you lose, isn't it easier to stop fighting, let the world go on without you?" Helen felt her heart squeeze at the raw anguish in those words. She understood suddenly that they weren't just talking about the families threatened by Dawson. They were talking about Isabel, about the loss that turned Arthur into a man who protected everyone but allowed no one to love him. They were talking about the walls he built and the fear that kept them standing. "It gets easier," she agreed softly. "But you're not the kind of man who chooses the easy way. You're the kind who chooses what's right, even when it costs a piece of you. That's why people here look at you the way they do. It's not for the strength of your arms, Arthur. It's for the strength of your heart." He was very quiet. "My heart is broken, Helen. Broken a long time ago." She reached out without thinking, placed her hand over his, resting on the arm of the chair. "Broken things can be mended," she whispered. "Just need someone with enough patience to put the pieces back together." His fingers turned under her hand, interlaced with hers, with gentle pressure. They stayed like that, holding hands in the darkness, while something fundamental shifted between them. They were no longer just boss and employee, no longer just 2 lonely people under the same roof. They were 2 souls recognizing in each other the possibility of healing, of beginning again, of perhaps loving again, despite all the fear. "Thank you," Arthur said finally, voice thick with emotion, "for not giving up on me." Helen squeezed his hand. "I'll never give up," she promised. And she knew it was true, knew she had already given her heart to that man, whether he was ready to receive it or not. The following week brought inevitable escalation. Dawson's thugs returned, this time to the property of old Christopher, an elderly farmer living alone since his wife died. They arrived at night, broke windows, killed chickens, left a clear message: "Sign the transfer, or it will be worse." The old man appeared at 3 Rivers Farm the next morning, shaking with fear and shame, asking if Arthur could do anything. Arthur went white with suppressed rage hearing the story, assured the old man he could stay at the farm until it was resolved, told Pete to take him to the guest room. Then he got his horse and left. Helen tried to ask where he was going, but Hattie held her arm. "Let him be, dear. He needs to do what he has to do." Arthur returned late afternoon with a closed face and blood on his knuckles, said nothing, went straight to wash his hands. It was Pete who told it later, voice mixed with admiration and worry. Arthur went straight to Dawson's property, walked right into the middle of the thugs, and asked to speak to the colonel. When Dawson appeared, Arthur said in front of everyone that the families were under his protection now, that anyone who touched them would have to go through him first. "And the colonel?" Helen asked with a racing heart. Pete grimaced, said Arthur was digging his own grave, that he'd regret it, but Arthur didn't back down. Stood there, firm, until Dawson went inside, and when one of the thugs tried to shove him on the way out, Arthur turned and broke the guy's nose with one punch, just one, then got on his horse and came back here. Helen found Arthur in the barn later, tending to his horse. He was tense, movements sharper than usual. "You're hurt?" she asked, seeing the swollen knuckles. "It's nothing," he replied without looking. "Did you come out here to give me a sermon on prudence?" he asked with a crisp tone that was defense, not true anger. "No," Helen said firmly. "I came to see if you're okay, because I know you did what you had to do, but I also know that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Not physically, but here." And she touched his chest lightly over the heart. Arthur finally looked at her, and there was raw pain in those eyes. "I don't know how to do it differently, Helen. I don't know how to let people suffer when I can do something. But I'm tired. Tired of fighting alone. Tired of carrying everything. Tired of—" He stopped, bit back the words that almost came out. "Tired of what?" she encouraged softly. He shook his head. "Never mind." But Helen took a step closer, forced him to look at her. "Tired of what, Arthur?" He took a deep breath, trembling. "Tired of being alone," he finally confessed, voice breaking. "Tired of having no one to come back to at the end of the day, no one who cares if I come back or not." "I care," Helen said immediately, intensely. "I care if you come back. I care if you're hurt. I care if you're tired or sad or afraid. I care about you, Arthur, much more than I should." The silence that followed was loaded with everything that wasn't being said. Arthur looked at her like a man lost in the desert looks at water. "Helen," he began, but she shook her head. "You don't have to say anything right now. Just need to know you're not alone. Not anymore." And then she did something bold, something that could change everything. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek, light, chaste, but loaded with promise. When she pulled back, she saw a single tear running down his face. Arthur closed his eyes, breathed shakily, and when he opened them again, there was surrender there. Surrender to the inevitable, to the feeling that had been growing despite all resistance. He raised his hand, touched her face with reverent care, like someone touching something precious that might break. Helen covered his hand with hers, turned her face to kiss the calloused palm. And there in the barn, smelling of hay and leather, in the silence broken only by quickened breaths, two hearts finally began to beat in the same rhythm. But the world doesn't stop for budding love, and the storm was just beginning. 3 days later, in the cold early hours, screams woke the house. Helen jumped out of bed, heart racing, ran outside. The eastern sky was too orange, too bright. Fire. Old Christopher's property was in flames. Arthur was already mounted on his horse, shouting orders. "Pete, Jenkins, grab buckets. Tommy, wake everyone up." Helen, without thinking twice, ran inside, changed her nightgown for a dress, and when Arthur took off at a gallop, followed by the men, she climbed onto the wagon Hattie was preparing with cloths and water. The scene they found was devastating. Old Christopher's small house burned fiercely, flames licking the sky, intense heat even yards away. The old man was outside on his knees weeping, while neighbors tried to save what they could. Arthur dismounted while moving, started organizing a bucket line, shouting instructions with a voice that cut through the panic. Helen worked alongside the men, passing buckets, wetting cloths, helping to pull objects from the house before the flames consumed everything. Smoke burned her eyes, ash fell like dirty snow. Heat was almost unbearable. But no one stopped. They fought for hours until the fire finally ceded, leaving only smoking ruins and loss. When the sun rose, it revealed complete destruction. The house was destroyed, the barn collapsed, animals dead or fled. Old Christopher was in shock, looking at the rubble of what had been his life, and on the fence, nailed to a post, was a message that made everyone's blood run cold. "You're next, Vance." Arthur ripped the paper down, crumpled it in his hand with a force that made his knuckles white. Helen saw the transformation in him. Cold rage replacing exhaustion, hard determination replacing doubt. Dawson had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Take Christopher to the farm," Arthur told Pete with a voice of steel. "He stays with us now." Pete nodded. "And you?" Arthur looked at the ruins, then at the people around, simple, scared families, good people who deserved to live in peace. "I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago," he replied. "I'm going to end this." Helen grabbed his arm. "Arthur, no, not alone." He looked at her, and there was something different in those eyes now. It wasn't just anger or determination. It was purpose. "I won't let him destroy any more lives, Helen. I won't, even if it costs mine." The words hung in the air like a threat and a promise, and Helen knew the moment she had always known would come had arrived. The moment where the man she loved would have to choose between safety and justice. And knowing Arthur as she did, she knew exactly which choice he would make. War was declared, and there would be no turning back. The news of the fire at old Christopher's property spread through the region like wildfire. By the end of the day, Three Rivers Farm had become an unlikely meeting point. Worried farmers, threatened families, simple folk who no longer knew where to seek protection. Hattie cooked non-stop. Helen helped accommodate people where she could, and Arthur received each one with a patience that hid the fury boiling underneath. Old Christopher was installed in the guest room, still in shock, repeating the same story of how he woke up smelling smoke, how he tried to save something, but the fire was already too big. Pete had ridden to the other two threatened properties, offered temporary shelter, returned with news that the families were terrified but safe for now. At nightfall, when everyone had finally settled, Arthur met with Pete, Jenkins, and Tommy in the barn. Helen, bringing coffee for the men, arrived in time to hear the conversation. She stood in the doorway, tray in hand, listening. "We have to go to Dawson," Pete was saying with a hard voice. "Can't wait for him to attack again. We go there, in numbers. Show we're not alone." Jenkins agreed, nodding. "I know 5 more men who'd come, folks Mr. Vance helped before who owe favors." Arthur was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, expression closed. "No," he said firmly. "I won't ask anyone to risk their life for this. I'm enough." Pete slammed his hand on the table. "It's not just for you. It's for all of us. Dawson won't stop. Today it was Christopher. Tomorrow it's me. Then Jenkins. He wants to show he can do whatever he wants and no one will stop him." "That is exactly why I need to go alone," Arthur replied. "If I take people, it becomes open war. People die in war. Innocents die. But if I go alone, the issue stays between me and him. Personal." Tommy, the youngest, asked with an uncertain voice, "And if he kills you, boss?" The silence that followed was heavy. It was Helen who broke it, walking into the barn with determined steps. "Then let's ensure that doesn't happen," she said with a voice firmer than she felt. The 4 men turned, surprised. Arthur straightened up. "Helen, this isn't—" "Don't tell me it's not my business," she interrupted, setting the tray on the table harder than necessary. "Everything that happens on this farm is my business now, and I won't stand by while you plan to go alone to face a man who has 6 armed thugs and no scruples." Arthur took a step towards her, voice dropping to an almost gentle tone. "Helen, I appreciate the concern, but this is dangerous. I can't put you at risk." She lifted her chin. "You think I'm not at risk already? That the message on the fence wasn't a threat to all of us? You think if something happens to you, Dawson just goes away and leaves the rest in peace?" The logic was irrefutable, and everyone knew it. Arthur ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "What do you suggest, then?" Helen took a deep breath. "I suggest you don't go alone, but don't take an army either. Take witnesses, people who can confirm what was said, what happened. Reverend Thomas, the sheriff, maybe even the judge if we can convince him to do his job right." Pete nodded slowly. "She's right. If you confront Dawson with authorities present, he can't just kill you without consequences. Has to at least pretend civility." Jenkins added, "And if you can get him to confess in front of those people that he's using illegal methods, that he forged documents, that he ordered the arson, it becomes a criminal matter, not just a dispute between private parties," Arthur completed, understanding where they were going. "But the judge is his friend. He won't want to get involved." Helen stepped closer. "Maybe he will if the story hits the papers, if it becomes a public scandal. A rich and powerful man using violence against poor families. My father worked with the editor of the Chicago newspaper. I can write a letter, explain the situation." Arthur looked at her with an expression of mixed admiration and fear. "You thought of everything." Helen held his gaze. "I thought about not losing you. The rest came with it." The raw declaration, spoken in front of everyone, made time stop for seconds. The other men exchanged discreet glances. Arthur opened his mouth, closed it, finally said, "We need to talk. Privately." Pete stood up immediately. "I think it's time for rounds, isn't it, Jenkins? Tommy, come help." The three left with thinly disguised haste, leaving Arthur and Helen alone in the barn, lit only by a hanging lantern. Arthur walked to her slowly, stopped so close Helen had to tilt her chin up to maintain eye contact. "You can't say things like that," he said with a rough voice. "Can't talk about losing me as if it mattered that way." "Why can't I?" she asked in a whisper. "Because it puts you in danger," he replied. "Because it makes me want to protect you more than I already do. Because it makes me think of things I can't have." "Why can't you?" Helen insisted, placing her hand on his chest, feeling the racing heart beneath his palm. "Because I lost everything I loved," he said with ancient pain tearing at the words. "Because I'm afraid if I love you, fate will rip you away from me too. Because I don't deserve to have again what I already had and wasted." Helen felt hot tears, but didn't let them fall. "You didn't waste anything. You loved your wife, and she was taken from you by a cruel accident. It wasn't your fault, and loving me won't make fate rip me away. It will make me stronger. It will make you stronger. Love isn't weakness, Arthur. It's the only real strength there is." He closed his eyes, breath trembling. When he opened them again, there was surrender there. "Helen, I don't know how to do this again. Don't know how to open my heart and trust it won't be destroyed." "Then let's go slow," she offered. "Don't need to promise forever right now. Just need to promise you won't push me away, that you'll let me stay by your side, come what may." Arthur raised his hand, brushed a lock of hair from her face with a touch so gentle more tears threatened. "You deserve more than a broken man picking fights with a dangerous colonel," he said with a sad half-smile. "I deserve a man who fights for what's right even when it costs everything," she corrected. "I deserve you." And then Arthur Vance, a man who had denied himself any affection for 4 years, who built walls around his heart and swore never to risk again, did the only thing that made sense. He lowered his head and kissed Helen with a tenderness that contrasted with the strength of his body, with a reverence that spoke of precious value, with a silent promise that maybe, just maybe, he could learn to love again. The kiss was sweet, chaste, but loaded with everything that hadn't been said. When they parted, both were trembling. Arthur rested his forehead on hers, eyes closed. "If something happens to me," he began, but she placed her fingers on his lips. "Nothing will happen, because you're not going alone, and because I'll be praying every second until you return, and then you will return, and we'll figure out together how to fix broken hearts." He laughed, a low, raspy sound that was more emotion than joy. "How did you get so strong, little one?" Helen smiled through tears. "I learned from you." The following days were of careful preparation. Helen wrote a detailed letter to the editor of the Chicago newspaper, explained the situation, attached written testimonies from the threatened families. Arthur went to town, talked at length with Reverend Thomas, who immediately agreed to help. The Reverend then went to the judge, applied moral and religious pressure, reminded him that bigger eyes were watching and justice had to be done, or there would be a scandal. The sheriff, a weak man who usually avoided confrontation with the powerful, was harder to convince. But when Pete mentioned the story, was already going to a big paper, and everyone would want to know why the law did nothing, the sheriff finally agreed to be present. A meeting was set at Colonel Dawson's property for 3 days later. Official meeting, witnesses present, to discuss accusations of document forgery and violent intimidation. The message was delivered formally by the sheriff, who returned saying the colonel had accepted with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The night before the confrontation, Helen could barely eat. Picked at the food on her plate, stomach churned with nerves. Arthur was quiet too, tension visible in his shoulders, his tight jaw. When dinner ended and Hattie retired, the two stayed alone in the kitchen. "I'm scared," Helen confessed in a low voice. "I know you're strong. I know you're not alone. But I'm scared anyway." Arthur came to her, pulled out the chair, sat and pulled her onto his lap with gentleness. Helen snuggled against his broad chest, listened to his heart beating strong and steady. "I am too," he admitted, kissing the top of her head. "I'd be a fool not to be, but I'm more scared of what happens if I do nothing. I can't live in a world where men like Dawson do what they want and no one stands up. And now I have an even bigger reason to fight." He tilted her face up, eyes intense. "I have you. I have a future I want to build, and I won't let him take that from me." "Promise you'll come back," Helen whispered. "Promise." "I promise," Arthur said against her lips before kissing her again, deeper this time, sealing the promise with everything he had. Morning arrived cold and clear. Arthur dressed with care, clean shirt, good trousers, polished boots. He wasn't going as a farmhand. He was going as a proprietor, a man of respect. Pete, Jenkins and Tommy also dressed up, would go along to the entrance of Dawson's property, would wait in case they were needed. Reverend Thomas arrived early, impeccable black cassock, serious expression. The sheriff appeared minutes later, nervous but present. The judge was the last, arrived with evident reluctance. Helen helped Arthur adjust his vest, hands trembling slightly. He held her hands, kissed her fingers one by one. "Back soon," he promised, "and when I get back, we need to talk about the future. About our future." Her heart leaped. "Our future?" Arthur smiled, a small but real smile. "You think after all this I'm going to let you leave? You're mine now, Helen Carter. If you'll accept a stubborn man with a complicated past and a tendency to find trouble." "I accept," she said through happy tears. "I accept all of you." He kissed her one more time, long and sweet, then mounted his horse and left, followed by the others. Helen stayed on the porch with Hattie, the two women watching the men disappear down the road. "He comes back," Hattie said with conviction. "That man has a lot left to live, has love waiting. Won't waste that." The hours that followed were the longest of Helen's life. Tried to work, tried to distract herself, but all she could do was pray and look at the road. Hattie prayed the rosary in a low voice, fingers running over worn beads. The sun rose in the sky, noon passed, evening began to fall. And then, when the sun was already starting to set, riders appeared on the road. Helen ran to the porch, heart in her throat, only managed to breathe when she saw Arthur in front, whole, alive. She ran down the steps, and when he dismounted, she threw herself into his arms with a force that almost knocked them over. "You're okay," she repeated against his chest. "You're okay." Arthur held her tight, face buried in her hair. "I am," he murmured. "I'm okay. It's over." Pete, dismounting behind, was grinning broadly. "You should have seen it, Miss Helen." The boss was magnificent. Reverend Thomas smiled too. It was a confrontation worthy of the history books. Subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories and hit the bell so you don't miss any. Inside the house, while Hattie served coffee and food, the story was told. Arthur started, voice calm, but there was satisfaction underneath. When we arrived, Dawson was waiting with his 6 thugs around him. Thought he was going to intimidate us. But when he saw the Reverend, the sheriff, and the judge, his face changed. Reverend Thomas continued, "I started speaking about the accusations, forged documents, intimidation. Dawson denied everything, of course, said the debts were legitimate, that he never sent anyone to threaten anyone. That's when Arthur pulled out the paper that was nailed to Christopher's fence." Arthur nodded, showed the note, showed the handwriting. Asked the sheriff to compare it with other documents of Dawson's. The handwriting was identical. The man had written his own threat, too arrogant to bother disguising it. The sheriff had no choice, had to acknowledge it. "And the judge?" Helen asked anxiously. Arthur grimaced. The judge tried to minimize, said it was just a misunderstanding between neighbors. But then the Reverend reminded, in front of everyone, about the letter that had already gone to the newspaper. About how the story was going to become public, about how the judge's superiors would want to know why he didn't act. Pete hit the table with satisfaction. The old man turned red, started sweating, finally said he would investigate the accusations formally, that the debt documents needed to be verified, that until further orders, no property could be touched. Dawson almost had a fit. But the best part, Jenkins added with a laugh, was when the boss looked straight at Dawson and said, if anything happened to anyone in the region, to any property, the first place the sheriff should investigate was his farm, that now there were witnesses, documentation, eyes watching. The colonel was on moral probation. Arthur shook his head. I have no illusion he turned into a saint. Men like him don't change, but now he's tied. Knows he can't act openly without consequences. He'll have to look for other victims in other places, where there's no one to oppose him. Helen held his hand on the table. You saved those families, saved Christopher, the others, saved everyone. We saved, Arthur corrected, looking deeply at her. It was your idea to involve authorities, to threaten with public exposure. I would have gone alone, probably ended up dead or arrested. You saved me from myself. The rest of the night was of measured celebration. Old Christopher cried with relief when he learned he could rebuild in peace. The other families were notified, arrived to thank with hugs and tears. 3 Rivers Farm, which for so long breathed loneliness, was full of life, hope, community. When everyone finally left and the house returned to silence, Arthur looked for Helen. She was on the porch looking at the stars, wrapped in a shawl against the night chill. He approached from behind, wrapped his arms around her, and the two stayed like that, in comfortable silence. I married Isabel when I was 23, Arthur said suddenly, voice low. She was the neighbor's daughter. We grew up together. It was a good marriage, quiet. We liked each other, had respect, built a life together. When she died, I thought I had died too. Spent 4 years just existing, not living. Helen listened without interrupting, sensing the importance of that moment. And then you arrived, he continued. Scared girl with a battered suitcase, trying to be strong when she was broken inside. And something in me recognized something in you. Pain calling pain, maybe, or soul calling soul. He turned her in his arms so they faced each other. I love you, Helen. Not the same way I loved Isabel, because you are not her and I am not who I was anymore. But I love you the way I am now, the way you made me return to being. Love you with everything left of me and everything you helped reborn. Tears flowed freely down her face now. I love you too. Loved you from the moment I saw you taking care of everyone but yourself. Loved your strength, your kindness, your huge heart you try to hide. Loved the man you are, broken and fixed and beautiful anyway. Arthur pulled something from his pocket. It was a simple gold ring, worn but well cared for. It was my grandmother's, he explained. Only thing of value I kept. Wanted to give it to Isabel, but she died before I could give her something like this. Kept it all these years not knowing why. Now I know. Was waiting for you. He knelt right there on the porch, big strong man on his knees before a girl who was less than half his size, but dominated his heart completely. Helen Carter, will you marry me? Let me spend the rest of my life loving you, protecting you, building a future by your side. Yes, she sobbed. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, fit perfectly as if made for her. Then he stood and kissed her under the stars, sealing a promise of a fresh start, of love rising from ashes, of two broken hearts that learned to beat together. The wedding happened 2 months later in the small church of Hopewell. Helen wore a simple white muslin dress, Hattie helped sew, wildflowers in her hair. Arthur was impeccable in a dark suit made specially, nervous as a boy but smiling like he hadn't smiled in years. The church was full. Old Christopher in the first row, emotional. The families Arthur had protected, the farm workers, neighbors, acquaintances, simple people coming to celebrate the union of two who deserved happiness after so much pain. Reverend Thomas conducted the ceremony with evident joy, voice firm when he declared them husband and wife. When Arthur kissed the bride, the church exploded in applause. And for the first time in a long time, tears that ran down his face were of pure joy. Life at Three Rivers Farm changed after that. It was still hard work, still had challenges, but now there was love filling the empty spaces. Helen became more than a wife. She became a true partner. Helped with accounts, gave opinions on planting, cared for workers when they fell ill. And Arthur, a man who had forgotten how to smile, laughed now, laughed at jokes during dinner, laughed when Helen tried to help with farm work and made a mess, laughed because he was happy and no longer afraid to admit it. Colonel Dawson, truth be told, didn't disappear completely, but kept his distance, focused his ambitions elsewhere. Public exposure and constant vigilance made him cautious. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough. The families in the region could sleep in peace, knowing they had a protector, had a voice. The community began to strengthen. Inspired by Arthur's example, others began to unite, to protect each other. Created an informal cooperative where they shared resources, helped one another. What had started as one lonely man's fight turned into a community movement of resistance and solidarity. And Three Rivers Farm became a symbol of that. House that once breathed mourning now breathed life. Hattie gained extra help when Helen started teaching some women in the region to read, small classes in the kitchen that became a weekly tradition. Arthur, in turn, started teaching farming techniques to small farmers, sharing knowledge instead of hoarding. 8 years later, Helen was on the porch of the house, now expanded with an extra room and larger living area. Rocked slowly in the chair, hand resting on the rounded belly of 7 months, it was the third pregnancy, and like the other two, was going well. Children's voices came from the orchard. Michael, 6 years old, father's dark hair and mother's curious eyes, chased chickens with loud laughter. Clara, 4, named in honor of Arthur's first wife, gathered flowers with serious concentration. The two children had filled the house with joy, with mess, with life. Arthur came from the field, carrying Michael on his shoulders, while Clara hung onto his leg. His hair was greyer now, lines around his eyes deeper, but there was a lightness in him that didn't exist before. Lightness of a man at peace with himself, with his choices, with his life. He put the children down, told them to wash hands for dinner, and stepped onto the porch. Kissed Helen long and sweet, big hand resting on her belly, feeling the baby kick. "How are my three loves?" he murmured. "Strong," she replied, smiling, anxious to meet their father. Arthur sat in the chair next to her, pulled her closer. "Sometimes I still don't believe it," he confessed, watching the children playing in the yard. 8 years ago I was dead inside, just existing, and now I have everything. You, the kids, one more on the way, purpose, joy. How does someone get so lucky?" "It's not luck," Helen said, interlacing fingers with his. "It's deserving. You're a good man, Arthur, always were. Just needed reminding that a good man deserves good things too." He kissed her temple. "You reminded me. Every day you remind me." Hattie appeared at the door, calling for dinner. The family went in together, children chattering about the day, Arthur asking questions, Helen laughing at wild stories. The table that for years stood in heavy silence now overflowed with conversation, laughter, love. After the children were tucked in bed, stories read and prayers recited, Arthur and Helen returned to the porch. It was their ritual, moment of peace at end of day, where they could simply be together. "Do you regret it?" Helen asked suddenly. "Everything you went through, everything you suffered, if you could go back and change it, would you?" Arthur thought for a long moment before answering. "The pain of losing Isabel will never disappear completely," he said honestly. "It was part of me, shaped who I am. But regret? No, because if things were different, maybe you never would have arrived here. Maybe I never would have learned that a heart can love more than once in different ways. All true." He looked at her, eyes shining in the soft lantern light. "Learned that strength isn't in never falling, but in getting up every time. Learned that love isn't limited, doesn't run out when given to one person. Learned that life goes on, and we honor those we lost by living fully, not dying along with them. And you taught me all that, little one. You and your stubborn heart that wouldn't take no for an answer." Helen rested her head on his shoulder. "We were two broken people who met at the right moment," she said softly. "You gave me a home when I had none. Gave me purpose when I was lost. Gave me love when I thought I'd never be loved. We fixed each other piece by piece. And we'll keep fixing," Arthur added, "because that's true love, not perfection, it's commitment. It's choosing every day to stay, fight, grow together. It's being strength when the other is weak, harbor when the other is lost, light when the other is in the dark." The following years only confirmed those words. Three Rivers Farm prospered, not just materially but in spirit. Became a place where people knew they could seek help, where justice was more than a pretty word. Arthur never stopped being protector of the community, but now did so with wisdom that comes from maturity, with balance between courage and prudence. The children grew strong and healthy. Michael inherited his father's sense of justice, was always defending the smaller ones at school. Clara had her mother's infinite kindness, cared for injured animals, shared toys without hesitation. And when the third son was born, another boy they named Thomas in honor of the Reverend, it completed the family perfectly. Helen never returned to Chicago, never felt the need. The life she built in the country beside the man she loved was worth more than any city comfort. Continued teaching women to read, expanded classes to include basic math and home management. Became a respected figure in the community, sought for advice, admired for quiet strength. And Arthur, man who swore never to love again, who built walls so high around his heart, learned that greatest courage isn't facing thugs or challenging colonels. Greatest courage is allowing oneself to be loved, opening heart even with fear, trusting that this time maybe happiness lasts. 20 years after the day Helen arrived with a battered suitcase and shattered heart, she was on the porch again. Was 42 years old now, hair with some white strands, lines around eyes that spoke of years of smiles. Arthur, at 53, had hair almost entirely grey, body still strong but marked by decades of hard work. Children were grown. Michael, 26, managed part of farm and was engaged to a girl from neighbouring town. Clara, 24, was teacher at local school, continuing mother's work of educating community. Thomas, 20, studied agronomy, wanted to modernise farming techniques. Farm had expanded, now included lands that belonged to Colonel Dawson, who died 5 years prior without heirs, and with so many debts everything was auctioned. Arthur bought part, divided other part among small farmers who had been threatened decades ago. Poetic justice, he had said at the time. Hattie had departed 3 years prior, slept peacefully at 87 years, surrounded by everyone she loved. Left void, never completely filled, but also left legacy of kindness, continuing alive in everyone she touched. "You're quiet," Arthur observed, sitting next to Helen. "What are you thinking?" She smiled. "Was thinking how strange life is. How the worst thing that happened to me, losing everything, having to leave Chicago, ended up being the best thing, because it brought me here, brought me you." Arthur took her hand, as natural now as breathing. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked. Helen shook her head. "I believe in choices. You chose not to give up when you lost Isabel, chose to keep fighting, protecting, living. I chose to accept your job offer even with fear, chose to stay even when it got hard, chose to love you even without guarantees. And you chose to love me back, were choices, not fate." Arthur smiled, that smile that still made her heart race after all these years. "Then I chose well," she laughed. "We chose well." The sun was setting, painting sky orange and pink. From house came sounds of dinner being prepared, grandchildren playing. Michael already had 2 small children. Life continued, eternal circle of generations, of love passing forward. And there on that porch, where so many conversations happened, so many plans were made, so many fears conquered, 2 hearts that learned to beat together rested in peace. Wasn't end of story. Was continuation, was legacy, was proof that true love not only survives, prospers, multiplies, transforms everything it touches. Helen Carter and Arthur Vance built more than prosperous farm or big family. Built example that it's never too late to start over, that broken heart can love again, that true strength isn't in never falling, but in always getting up. That sometimes best love stories start in most unlikely places, between most unlikely people, and last forever not because they are perfect, but because they are true. And when, many years later, their great-grandchildren asked how great-grandparents' story started, answer was always same. Started when she arrived with nothing and he was lost in everything. And together, found what really matters, found each other, found home. Found love that crosses time, pain, fear, and everything else. Love that is, in the end, only thing that really stays. And this is the most beautiful love story between a widowed farmer and the young woman who taught his heart to live again.